one name struck terror into the hearts of Christian Europe: Mehmed II, the Conqueror. This was not merely a title of honor, but a warning etched in blood across the battlefields of 3 continents. Before we delve into the darkness of his reign, ask yourself, what does it take to become a legend feared by millions? What horrors must a man commit for his enemies to prefer death over capture? The answers lie in the chronicles of massacres, impalements, and calculated brutality that defined Mehmed's path to supremacy. History remembers conquerors, but it immortalizes monsters. Mehmed II walked the line between both with deliberate precision. His reign began not with coronation ceremonies or diplomatic pleasantries, but with an act so cold it set the tone for everything that followed: the murder of his own infant brother, drowned in a bath to eliminate any rival claim to the throne. This was the Ottoman way of power, and Mehmed embraced it without hesitation. To his followers, he was the fulfillment of ancient prophecies, the sword of Islam, destined to conquer the city of Caesar. To his enemies, he was something far darker, a force of nature wrapped in human flesh, merciless and unstoppable. The year 1451 marked the beginning of a reign that would reshape the world through fire and steel. At merely 19 years old, Mehmed ascended to the Ottoman throne for the 2nd time, having briefly ruled as a child under the shadow of his father's advisors. But this time he returned as a man possessed by singular ambition: the conquest of Constantinople, the jewel of Christendom that had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years. The Byzantines had mocked his youth during his first reign, calling him a boy playing at Sultan. They would learn in the most terrible way imaginable that this boy had grown into something far more dangerous. Mehmed's preparation for the fall of Constantinople revealed a mind that calculated victory not in terms of glory, but in terms of absolute domination. He understood that fear was a weapon as potent as any cannon, and he wielded it with the skill of a master craftsman. Before the siege even began, he demonstrated his intentions by constructing the Rumeli fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, a massive stone declaration of war that strangled Byzantine maritime trade. When Venetian ships attempted to pass without his permission, Mehmed's response was characteristically brutal. The ships were seized, the sailors were executed, and their captain was impaled on a stake where he died slowly over 3 days, visible to anyone sailing the strait. The siege of Constantinople in 1453 was not merely a military campaign. It was a calculated campaign of psychological warfare designed to break the spirit of the defenders before the walls ever fell. Mehmed commanded an army of over 80,000 men, supported by the largest cannons the world had ever seen, weapons so massive they required hundreds of oxen to transport and crews of over 200 men to operate. The Hungarian engineer Urban, who had offered his services first to the Byzantines and been rejected due to lack of funds, found a willing patron in Mehmed. The Sultan understood that Constantinople's legendary walls, which had repelled countless invaders for centuries, could be reduced to rubble through the application of overwhelming force. For 53 days, the bombardment continued relentlessly. The massive cannons fired stone balls weighing over 600 pounds, each shot capable of demolishing entire sections of wall. The noise was deafening, a constant thunder that denied the defenders sleep and eroded their sanity as surely as the cannonballs eroded their fortifications. Mehmed ordered the bombardment to continue day and night, understanding that exhaustion would prove as deadly an enemy as Ottoman steel. The defenders, numbering barely 7,000 men under Emperor Constantine V, fought with the desperation of those who knew no quarter would be given. The psychological tactics extended beyond mere bombardment. Mehmed ordered his engineers to dig tunnels beneath the walls, a strategy the defenders could hear but struggled to counter. Byzantine engineers, led by the Scottish soldier John Grant, worked frantically to dig counter-tunnels and collapse the Ottoman efforts, but the constant threat of the ground beneath them giving way added another layer of terror to the siege. Mehmed also employed massive siege towers that rolled toward the walls on countless wheels, sheltering archers and soldiers who could fire down upon the defenders. At night, the Ottoman camp blazed with thousands of fires, a constellation of threat that surrounded the city, while the Sultan's personal tent, made of scarlet silk and positioned where the defenders could see it, served as a constant reminder of who orchestrated their doom. Perhaps most psychologically devastating were Mehmed's displays of his captured enemies. When small groups of defenders were taken alive in skirmishes outside the walls, the Sultan ordered them impaled on stakes in full view of their comrades still manning the defenses. These men died slowly, their screams audible across the battlefield, their bodies left to rot as warnings. Mehmed understood that each impaled soldier represented not just one death, but dozens of demoralized defenders who would question whether continued resistance was worth such a fate. This calculated cruelty was not the rage of a barbarian, but the cold methodology of a leader who had studied the art of breaking human will. The fall of Constantinople. When the walls of Constantinople finally fell on May 29, 1453, the true horror of Mehmed's conquest began. The Sultan had promised his soldiers 3 days of plunder, a traditional reward that he knew would motivate his troops to fight with suicidal bravery. What followed was one of the most brutal sacks in history, a nightmare of violence that transformed the ancient city into a charnel house. Ottoman soldiers poured through the breached walls like a flood of steel and fury, their bloodlust unleashed after weeks of grueling siege warfare. The streets ran red with blood as soldiers, civilians, women, children, and the elderly were cut down without distinction. The churches, which had offered sanctuary during countless previous crises, became slaughterhouses. The Hagia Sophia, the magnificent cathedral that had stood for nearly 1,000 years as the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, witnessed scenes of unimaginable brutality. Thousands of civilians had crowded inside, praying for divine intervention that would never come. When Ottoman soldiers broke through the doors, they found not warriors, but terrified families clutching icons and crosses. The massacre that followed was methodical and complete. The marble floors, which had seen the coronations of emperors and the prayers of generations, were slick with blood. Those who were not killed immediately were bound in chains for the slave markets, their fates arguably worse than those who died quickly. Mehmed himself rode into the conquered city on the afternoon of the first day, and what he saw appeared to satisfy some dark requirement in his soul. Chronicles describe his tour through the city streets, observing the carnage with an expression that contemporary sources described as pleased satisfaction. He dismounted at the Hagia Sophia and ascended to the Great Dome, where he proclaimed the building would be converted into a mosque. As he stood there, surrounded by the architectural wonder of Byzantine civilization, soldiers below continued dragging civilians from their hiding places. The Sultan observed this too, making no move to stop the plunder he had promised. The fate of Emperor Constantine V became a matter of legend and propaganda. The last Roman emperor died fighting in the breach, his body lost among the thousands of dead that littered the walls and streets. When Mehmed learned that Constantine could not be found, he ordered a search through the mountains of corpses. Some accounts suggest the emperor's body was eventually identified by the golden eagles embroidered on his boots, though the reliability of such claims remains questionable. What is certain is that Mehmed ordered the emperor's head to be cut off and displayed, though whether from an identified body or a convincing substitute, we cannot know. The head was paraded through the streets of the Ottoman capital and later sent as a grim trophy to various Muslim courts, a warning of what befell those who opposed the Sultan. The 3 days of plunder that Mehmed had promised stretched in reality into chaos that took weeks to fully control. The enslaving of the population was systematic and brutal. Families were torn apart as soldiers claimed their human spoils, with young women and boys particularly prized in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. Contemporary sources estimate that between 30,000 and 50,000 people were enslaved, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. The elderly and infirm, who had little value as slaves, were often simply killed and their bodies thrown into the streets or the sea. Wealthy citizens who had hidden in their homes were tortured to reveal the locations of their treasures, with hot irons and other implements used to force confessions. Mehmed's treatment of the city's nobility revealed his understanding of power and humiliation. The most prominent Byzantine families, those who had ruled and administered the empire for generations, were systematically humiliated and destroyed. Grand Duke Lucas Notaras, the most powerful man in Constantinople after the emperor, had survived the initial slaughter and was brought before Mehmed. The Sultan initially treated him with apparent respect, but when Notaras refused Mehmed's demand to hand over his 14-year-old son for the Sultan's pleasure, the facade dropped. Mehmed ordered Notaras executed, along with his sons and sons-in-law, all beheaded in front of each other in order of age, so that the father would watch his male lineage destroyed before his own death. The wealth of Constantinople, accumulated over 1,000 years as capital of the Byzantine Empire, was methodically stripped. Churches were ransacked for their golden icons and jeweled reliquaries. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were burned or scattered, with priceless works of ancient Greek and Roman literature lost forever. Mehmed took the most valuable items for his personal treasury, but vast amounts of wealth simply disappeared into the chaotic distribution among his soldiers. The systematic looting continued for weeks after the formal 3 days of plunder, as soldiers searched every corner of the city for hidden valuables and civilians who might have escaped the initial sweep. The transformation of Constantinople into Istanbul marked not just a change of name, but a deliberate erasure of its Christian identity. Mehmed ordered all major churches converted into mosques or demolished. Residential quarters were repopulated with Muslims from Anatolia and other parts of his empire, while the surviving Christian population was reduced to second-class status. The Sultan installed a new Greek Orthodox patriarch, but under conditions that made clear the church existed only at his sufferance. This was conquest not merely as military victory, but as complete civilizational replacement, a model Mehmed would replicate in varying degrees throughout his reign. The brother killer. To understand the depths of Mehmed's ruthlessness, we must return to the beginning of his reign and examine the act that set the template for everything that followed: the murder of his infant brother. Ottoman succession was governed by a brutal pragmatism expressed in the law of fratricide, which stated, "Whichever of my sons inherits the Sultan's throne, it behooves him to kill his brothers in the interest of the world order." This law, formalized by Mehmed himself after his accession, merely codified what had been Ottoman practice for generations. But even by these harsh standards, the cold efficiency with which Mehmed eliminated his potential rivals shocked contemporary observers. Ahmed, Mehmed's infant half-brother, was the son of Sultan Murad II's widow. The child was barely weeks old when Mehmed ascended to the throne, representing no immediate threat but a potential future challenge to legitimacy. Mehmed's solution was characteristically direct. He ordered the child drowned in a bath, a method that left no marks and could be explained as an unfortunate accident if needed. The baby's mother was powerless to intervene, watched by guards as her son was held beneath the water until his struggles ceased. Contemporary Ottoman chroniclers recorded this event with neither outrage nor surprise, merely noting it as a necessary act of statecraft. But Mehmed's elimination of threats extended beyond his immediate family. His father, Murad II, had left behind a complex web of potential claimants and power brokers within the Ottoman court. The Grand Vizier, Sandarlı Halil Pasha, who had served Mehmed's father loyally and had opposed the young sultan's aggressive plans for Constantinople, found himself increasingly isolated. Chandler represented the old guard of Ottoman politics, favoring consolidation over expansion, diplomacy over conquest. He had openly mocked Mehmed's ambitions as the fantasies of a reckless youth. After the fall of Constantinople proved Mehmed right, the Sultan had his Grand Vizier executed on charges of treason, real or fabricated. The execution of Chandler was particularly cruel in its timing and manner. Mehmed waited until after his greatest triumph to move against the man who had doubted him, making the execution both personal revenge and political statement. The former Grand Vizier was strangled with a bowstring, the traditional method for executing Ottoman officials, but Mehmed ordered his property confiscated and his family stripped of all honors. The message was clear: doubt the Sultan and your entire legacy will be erased. This execution sent shockwaves through the Ottoman court, as Chandler had been among the most powerful men in the empire. If he could be eliminated so easily, no one was safe. Mehmed's paranoia about potential threats extended to provincial governors and military commanders who grew too powerful or popular. Ishak Pasha, who had been one of Murad II's most successful generals, found himself accused of corruption and executed shortly after Mehmed's accession. The charges were likely fabricated, but the real crime was being too closely associated with the previous regime. Mehmed understood that loyalty to his father's memory might translate into resistance to his own authority. Throughout his reign, he would repeat this pattern: identify potential centers of power, fabricate or discover justifications for their removal, and eliminate them before they could become threats. The Sultan's treatment of his own sons, late in his reign, revealed how deeply this fratricidal culture had embedded itself in Ottoman governance. When Prince Mustafa, one of Mehmed's sons, became popular with the Janissaries, the Sultan saw a potential threat. Mustafa died suddenly under mysterious circumstances in 1474, with strong suspicions that Mehmed had ordered his assassination. The official story claimed illness, but few in the court believed it. A father's willingness to kill his own son to prevent a potential future coup demonstrated the extent to which power had consumed all other considerations in Mehmed's worldview. The psychological impact of growing up in such an environment where brothers, uncles, and cousins represented mortal threats cannot be underestimated in understanding Mehmed's character. From childhood, he had been taught that power was a zero-sum game where any rival, no matter how loyal they appeared, might eventually become an enemy. This worldview shaped his dealings not just with family, but with all subordinates and enemies. Trust was a luxury he could not afford. Mercy, a weakness that would be exploited. Every decision was filtered through the lens of power dynamics and potential threats. The law of fratricide would be formally codified and continue in the Ottoman Empire for centuries after Mehmed, with sultans routinely executing all their brothers upon accession. Mehmed III, in 1595, would execute 19 of his brothers in a single day. The practice finally ended only in the 17th century, replaced with the slightly less brutal tradition of imprisoning potential rivals in the palace. But it was Mehmed II who perfected this system, who demonstrated that the most efficient path to secure power was to eliminate all alternatives, regardless of blood ties or moral considerations. In this, as in so many things, his reign set precedents that would echo through centuries. The Impaler's enemy. The conflict between Mehmed II and Vlad III of Wallachia, known as Vlad the Impaler, stands as one of history's most brutal confrontations between two masters of psychological warfare. Both men understood the power of terror. Both wielded cruelty as a weapon, but their methods and motivations differed in ways that made their collision inevitable and horrific. Vlad had been a hostage at the Ottoman court in his youth, alongside his brother Radu, and had learned to hate his captors with a passion that would fuel his resistance for years to come. The sexual abuse he endured there, whether rumored or real, certainly influenced his later actions. When Vlad seized power in Wallachia, he immediately stopped paying tribute to Mehmed, a direct challenge the Sultan could not ignore. Mehmed's initial response to Vlad's defiance was to send envoys demanding submission and the overdue tribute. What happened to those envoys became legend and revealed the depth of animosity between these two rulers. According to chronicles, Vlad received the Ottoman envoys but became enraged when they refused to remove their turbans in his presence, claiming it was against their custom. Vlad's response was characteristically brutal and darkly ironic. He ordered the turbans nailed to the envoys' heads, saying he would help them keep their custom. The envoys were then sent back to Mehmed, their turbans indeed inseparable from their skulls, a message written in blood and agony. The night attack of 1462 represented Vlad's most audacious strike against Mehmed and demonstrated the Wallachian prince's understanding of psychological warfare. As Mehmed marched into Wallachia with an army estimated at 60,000 to 90,000 men, Vlad employed scorched earth tactics, poisoning wells, burning crops, and leaving the Ottoman army nothing to forage. Then, on the night of June 17th, Vlad launched a surprise cavalry raid directly at Mehmed's camp, aiming to kill the Sultan himself. The attack came in darkness, with Vlad's forces dressed in Ottoman uniforms to create confusion, slaughtering their way through the camp toward Mehmed's tent. The night attack nearly succeeded in decapitating the Ottoman leadership. Mehmed's guards fought desperately in the darkness, unable to distinguish friend from foe until Vlad's cavalry eventually withdrew before dawn. The Sultan himself came frighteningly close to death, saved only by the quick thinking of his personal bodyguards, who formed a human shield around his tent. Contemporary sources claim that thousands of Ottoman soldiers died in the chaos, many killed by their own comrades in the confusion. The psychological impact was even more devastating. The invincible conqueror of Constantinople had nearly been killed in his own camp by a force a fraction of the size of his army. But Mehmed's true horror at Vlad's hands came not in battle, but in what he discovered as his army advanced deeper into Wallachia. The Forest of the Impaled, as it came to be known, was a grotesque display that shocked even the hardened Ottoman soldiers. For miles approaching the Wallachian capital of Târgoviște, the roads were lined with thousands of stakes, each bearing an impaled Ottoman prisoner. The bodies, in various stages of decay, created a landscape of horror. The stench was overpowering, the sight nightmarish. Some victims had been impaled weeks earlier and were now skeletal remains, while others had been placed more recently and still moved weakly, their dying groans audible. The exact number of impaled prisoners in this forest of death remains disputed, with estimates ranging from 10,000 to 20,000. What struck Mehmed most, according to Ottoman chroniclers, was the discovery of his former friend, Hamza Pasha, among the impaled. Hamza had been sent earlier with a vanguard force and had been captured. Vlad had him impaled on the tallest stake, dressed in his finest clothes, surrounded by impaled members of his household and army. The display was positioned where Mehmed could not miss it, a personal message from Vlad demonstrating that rank offered no protection from his wrath. Contemporary sources claim this sight affected Mehmed so deeply that he withdrew from the campaign, leaving his generals to continue the pursuit of Vlad. Mehmed's retreat from Wallachia was strategic rather than cowardly, but it marked one of the few times the Sultan abandoned a campaign without achieving his objective. The forest of impaled bodies had served its psychological purpose. It demonstrated that Vlad was willing to match and exceed any atrocity Mehmed might commit. The Ottoman army, demoralized by disease, lack of supplies, and the horrific sights they had witnessed, was in no condition for a prolonged campaign through hostile territory. Mehmed instead deployed Vlad's brother Radu, who had remained loyal to the Ottomans, to lead a force of Wallachian collaborators and Ottoman troops to unseat Vlad. The ultimate fate of Vlad came years later, but Mehmed's revenge was thorough and systematic. After Vlad was finally captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned, then later released and attempting to reclaim his throne, he was killed in battle in 1476. Some sources suggest assassination by Ottoman agents, though the details remain murky. What is certain is that Mehmed ordered Vlad's body, when finally recovered, to be decapitated and the head preserved in honey and sent to Constantinople. The Sultan displayed the head on a stake in his capital, a final ironic reversal, where the impaler himself became the impaled, at least in symbolic form. The message was clear: challenge Mehmed's supremacy, and eventually, no matter how long it took, his revenge would find you. The Bosnian Campaign. Mehmed's conquest of Bosnia in 1463 revealed the full machinery of his imperial terror applied to an entire kingdom. Bosnia had maintained a precarious independence through tribute and diplomacy. Its king, Stephen Tomasevic, hoping that his recent conversion to Catholicism would bring Western support against Ottoman expansion. It was a fatal miscalculation. When Tomasevic stopped paying tribute and sought Hungarian alliance, Mehmed responded with the full weight of his military power. The campaign was not merely about territorial expansion, but about sending a message to every vassal state in the Balkans about the cost of defiance. The speed of the campaign stunned contemporary observers. Mehmed invaded Bosnia in May 1463 with an army estimated at 150,000 men, an overwhelming force that swept through the kingdom like a scythe through wheat. Fortresses that might have withstood siege for months surrendered after days, their garrisons aware of what happened to those who resisted the Sultan. Within weeks, Mehmed had captured the capital at Bobovac and most of the major fortified cities. King Tomasevic, who had expected his fortresses to hold long enough for Hungarian reinforcements to arrive, found himself trapped in the fortress of Cluj with nowhere to run. Tomasevic's surrender was negotiated under promises of safe conduct that Mehmed had no intention of honoring. The king sent envoys to negotiate, and Mehmed swore on the Quran that Tomasevic and his family would be spared if he surrendered the fortress and the royal treasury. It was a lie calculated to avoid the cost and time of a prolonged siege. Tomasevic, perhaps desperate to believe, perhaps with no other choice, surrendered himself, his family, and what remained of Bosnia's royal treasury. He was brought before Mehmed at the Sultan's camp near Jajce, where the facade of clemency immediately dropped. The execution of King Tomasevic was designed as public spectacle and warning. Mehmed ordered the king beheaded in front of his assembled army and the captured Bosnian nobles. But the execution was not swift or clean. The executioner's sword, whether intentionally dulled or through deliberate incompetence, required multiple blows to sever the king's head. Tomasevic's dying screams and the progressively more desperate hacking of the executioner became a public display of humiliation. The king's head was then placed on a stake and displayed at the entrance to Mehmed's camp, while his body was left unburied for days, food for dogs and birds. The slaughter extended to much of the Bosnian nobility. Mehmed had promised safe conduct to those who surrendered, but such promises meant nothing when strategically inconvenient. Over 70 Bosnian nobles were executed in the days following Tomasevic's death, most by beheading, some by impalement. The executions were methodical and public, designed to break any thought of resistance among the surviving population. Families who had ruled their regions for generations were extinguished in a matter of days. The wealth they had accumulated, hoarded in castles and monasteries, was seized and distributed among Mehmed's commanders and soldiers. The fate of Bosnia's population revealed the systematic nature of Ottoman conquest under Mehmed. Entire regions were depopulated through a combination of massacre and enslavement. Young boys were taken for the Devshirme system, forcibly converted to Islam and trained as janissaries, severed forever from their families and original identities. Young women were distributed among the soldiers or sent to slave markets. The elderly and infirm, having no economic value, were often simply killed. Contemporary estimates suggest that between 30,000 and 100,000 Bosnians were either killed or enslaved during the campaign, though exact numbers are impossible to verify. The conversion of Bosnia to Islam began immediately, not through missionary work, but through force and economic pressure. Mehmed understood that lasting conquest required not just military victory, but cultural transformation. Churches were converted to mosques or demolished. Christian clergy were given the choice of conversion, exile, or death. Most fled to Hungarian territory, leaving the Christian population without spiritual leadership. Those Christians who remained were subjected to discriminatory taxes and legal restrictions that made conversion to Islam economically advantageous. Within generations, Bosnia would transform from a predominantly Christian kingdom to a largely Muslim province, a demographic change rooted in Mehmed's policies of forced assimilation. The speed and completeness of Bosnia's fall shocked Christian Europe and demonstrated the futility of resisting Mehmed without substantial military backing. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, who had promised support to Tomasevic, arrived with his army only after Bosnia had already fallen. The Hungarian king managed to recapture some northern fortresses, but the Kingdom of Bosnia was effectively finished. For Mehmed, the campaign had been a complete success, achieved in a matter of weeks. It became a model he would replicate with variations throughout the Balkans. Overwhelming force, broken promises, public executions of leaders, and systematic depopulation through massacre and slavery. The siege of Trebizond. The fate of Trebizond, the last surviving fragment of the Byzantine Empire, demonstrated that Mehmed's vengeance against the Byzantine legacy was not satisfied by the conquest of Constantinople alone. The Empire of Trebizond had survived on the southeastern shore of the Black Sea, a Greek-speaking Christian realm that had maintained independence for over 2 centuries after Constantinople itself had fallen to the Fourth Crusade. By 1461, with Mehmed consolidating his power across Anatolia and the Balkans, Trebizond's continued existence became intolerable to the Sultan's vision of total dominion. Emperor David Megas Komnenos, ruler of Trebizond, understood his position was hopeless. His empire consisted of little more than the capital city and a narrow strip of coastal territory, surrounded by Ottoman domains. His pleas for Western assistance went largely unanswered, as Christian Europe had proven unable or unwilling to aid Constantinople and showed no more interest in saving its distant cousin. David attempted diplomatic submission, offering tribute and his daughter for Mehmed's harem, hoping to buy continued existence as a vassal state. Mehmed accepted the gifts, but prepared for conquest regardless. The siege of Trebizond in 1461 was less a military challenge than a formality. Mehmed appeared before the city with an overwhelming force that made resistance clearly suicidal. The city's defenders numbered perhaps a few thousand, while Mehmed's army exceeded 80,000. More importantly, the Sultan brought his massive cannons, the same weapons that had reduced Constantinople's legendary walls to rubble. The message was clear: surrender or be destroyed. The bombardment lasted only days before cracks appeared in the fortifications, both physical and psychological. Emperor David negotiated surrender terms that Mehmed initially appeared to accept with relative generosity. David and his family would be allowed to leave with their personal wealth and resettle in Ottoman territory with estates and income befitting former royalty. This apparent clemency may have been genuine in Mehmed's mind at the time, or it may have been calculated deception. What is certain is that Mehmed allowed the imperial family to leave Trebizond with a substantial entourage and treasury, settling them initially at the town of Demotica in Thrace. For a time, it appeared that the last Byzantine emperor would be permitted to live out his days in comfortable, if powerless, retirement. The mercy proved temporary. In 1463, 2 years after Trebizond's fall, David was accused of plotting with foreign powers to restore his empire. The evidence was likely fabricated or at minimum exaggerated, but Mehmed needed no solid justification. The very existence of a legitimate Byzantine claimant, even a broken one, represented a potential rallying point for future resistance. Mehmed's solution was characteristically final. He ordered David and his sons executed. The former emperor and his male heirs were beheaded in a grim ceremony that extinguished the Komnenos dynasty and any legitimate claim to Byzantine restoration. The fate of David's younger sons was particularly cruel in its calculated nature. His youngest boy, still a child, was brought before Mehmed after his father's execution. Ottoman sources claim Mehmed offered the child a choice: convert to Islam and live in comfort at the Ottoman court, or die as a Christian. The boy, whether through courage, indoctrination, or incomprehension of the stakes, refused conversion. Mehmed ordered him executed, though accounts differ on whether this was carried out immediately or after a period of imprisonment and repeated pressure to convert. The death of a child for religious conviction, whether martyrdom or murder depending on perspective, demonstrated that Mehmed's elimination of threats extended even to those too young to pose any real danger. David's widow and daughters faced a fate that many might consider worse than execution. They were added to Mehmed's harem, a common practice that served multiple purposes: humiliation of conquered dynasties, prevention of legitimate heirs through other marriages, and symbolic domination of conquered peoples. To take the wife and daughters of a defeated emperor and make them concubines was to assert ultimate power over the defeated, to reduce them from royalty to property. The psychological torture of surviving as a sultan's concubine, knowing your husband and sons had been murdered and your empire erased, might indeed have been crueler than a quick death. The complete destruction of Trebizond's independence and the extinction of its ruling dynasty marked the final end of Rome in any form. The empire that had begun with Augustus and survived in Constantinople for 1,000 years after Rome's fall, that had continued in Trebizond even after Constantinople's conquest, was now entirely erased from the map. Mehmed had achieved what no previous Muslim ruler had accomplished: the complete military and political elimination of the Roman legacy. The cities remained, the populations continued, but the institutional continuity that stretched back to antiquity was severed forever. In this achievement, if it can be called that, Mehmed's place in history was secure. The Venetian Wars, the protracted conflict between Mehmed II and the Venetian Republic, demonstrated that the Sultan's brutality was not reserved for weak opponents, but was intensified when facing powerful enemies. Venice, with its maritime supremacy and far-flung trading empire, represented everything Mehmed sought to eliminate: an independent Christian power that stood between Ottoman ambition and total dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean. The war that began in 1463 and continued intermittently until after Mehmed's death was characterized by atrocities on both sides, but the Sultan's actions stood out for their calculated cruelty, designed to break Venetian will. The early years of the conflict saw Ottoman armies sweep through Venetian possessions in Greece and the Aegean. When Mehmed's forces conquered the important Venetian fortress of Argos in the Peloponnese, the garrison's fate became a warning to other Venetian holdings. The fortress commander and several of his officers were sawn in half vertically, a method of execution so agonizing that victims often remained conscious through much of the process. The remaining garrison members were either impaled or sent to Ottoman galleys as rowing slaves, a fate that meant years of brutal labor chained to an oar until death from exhaustion, disease, or battle. The island of Negroponte, known today as Euboea, fell to Mehmed in 1470, after a siege that demonstrated the futility of resistance against Ottoman overwhelming force. The Venetian commander, Paolo Erizzo, had defended the fortress with skill and courage, inflicting significant casualties on the besieging Ottomans. When the walls finally fell after weeks of bombardment and assault, Mehmed entered the conquered fortress and surveyed the damage to his army with visible anger. Rizzo was brought before him in chains, and the Sultan offered him life and wealth in exchange for converting to Islam and entering Ottoman service. It was a test of sorts, one Rizzo predictably failed. When Rizzo refused conversion, Mehmed's response revealed the Sultan's methods for breaking the morale of enemy commanders who might inspire future resistance. The Venetian commander was not simply executed. He was tortured to death in the main square of Negroponte in view of the surviving Venetian population and Ottoman soldiers. The exact method varied in different accounts, but most agree he was sawn in half, though some sources claim he was flayed alive first. The process took hours, with Rizzo's screams echoing through the captured fortress as a lesson to anyone who might consider heroic resistance in future. The fate of Negroponte's civilian population followed a pattern Mehmed had established throughout his conquests. The military-age men who survived the siege were either executed or enslaved for galley service. Women and children were distributed among the soldiers or sold in slave markets. The city itself was repopulated with Muslims from Anatolia, transforming its character from a Venetian trading hub to an Ottoman provincial town. Churches were converted to mosques. Venetian architectural elements were defaced or removed, and any symbol of the city's Christian past was systematically erased. This was conquest not merely as military victory, but as cultural annihilation. The Albanian campaigns, where Ottoman forces fought Venetian-backed Albanian resistance, saw atrocities that shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to medieval warfare. When Mehmed's armies captured Albanian villages suspected of supporting resistance fighters, the reprisals were total. Entire populations were massacred, with special attention paid to children who were killed in front of their parents before the adults themselves were executed. Some sources describe children being thrown onto spears or dashed against rocks, atrocities designed to break the spirit of Albanian resistance by eliminating not just the current generation, but the next one as well. The financial toll of the Venetian wars eventually forced the Republic to sue for peace, but not before Mehmed had demonstrated his reach by launching raids into Venetian territory in Italy itself. In 1480, an Ottoman fleet landed at Otranto on the Italian mainland, the first time since the early Middle Ages that Muslim armies had established a foothold in Western Europe. The sack of Otranto was brief but horrific, with thousands killed and the survivors enslaved. The city's archbishop, along with many clergy and nobles, were executed when they refused conversion to Islam. Their deaths were deliberately public and brutal. Sawn in half or beheaded after torture, their bodies displayed as warnings of Ottoman power. The relief of Otranto came only with Mehmed's death in 1481, after which the Ottoman forces withdrew, unable to hold the isolated foothold without the Sultan's driving will. But the psychological impact lingered. Venice had lost major territories, suffered economic devastation, and learned that no corner of its empire was beyond Mehmed's reach. The peace treaty signed in 1479 was less a negotiated settlement than Venetian submission to reality. The Republic would never fully recover its pre-war position, and the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean had shifted permanently toward Ottoman dominance. The methods of terror. To understand Mehmed's impact on his era, one must examine not just his conquests, but the specific methods of terror he employed to maintain dominance. Impalement, the most infamous of his techniques, was not merely an execution method, but a calculated psychological weapon. The process involved forcing a sharpened stake through a victim's body in a way that avoided immediate death, usually entering through the rectum and emerging near the shoulder. Skilled executioners could keep victims alive for hours or even days, their prolonged agony serving as entertainment for soldiers and warning to observers. Mass impalements became Mehmed's signature response to rebellion or particularly stubborn resistance. After suppressing an uprising in Albania, Ottoman chroniclers recorded that over 2,000 rebels were impaled along the main roads, their bodies left to rot as warnings. The spacing was deliberate, close enough that travelers could not avoid seeing them, far enough apart that the forest of stakes stretched for miles. The psychological impact on the population was profound. Resistance became not just futile, but guaranteed to result in the most agonizing death imaginable for you and potentially your entire family. Public executions under Mehmed's rule became theatrical productions designed to maximize terror. Simple beheading was reserved for minor offenses or when the Sultan wanted to show relative mercy. More serious crimes or higher status victims warranted more elaborate deaths. Sawing victims in half vertically, starting from the groin, ensured maximum consciousness during the process. Flaying alive, where the skin was methodically removed while the victim remained conscious, could take hours or days depending on the executioner's skill. These were not frenzied acts of bloodlust, but calculated ceremonies with audiences of both Ottoman soldiers and conquered populations. The Sultan's treatment of captured noble prisoners revealed an understanding of class warfare and psychological domination. European nobles captured in battle expected, based on medieval custom, to be held for ransom, a gentleman's agreement that had governed warfare for centuries. Mehmed deliberately violated these expectations as a demonstration that Ottoman power answered to no European conventions. Nobles who expected comfortable captivity awaiting ransom were instead subjected to the same brutalities as common soldiers, or worse. The message was clear. Your rank, your breeding, your family connections mean nothing before Ottoman power. Religious minorities in newly conquered territories faced systematic persecution designed to force conversion or exodus. Christian priests and monks received particular attention. As Mehmed understood, they were the cultural anchors of resistance to Ottoman rule. In city after city, clergy were given stark choices: convert to Islam, flee to Christian territory, or face execution. Those who chose martyrdom were often executed in deliberately blasphemous ways, crucifixion being particularly favored for its ironic mirroring of Christian symbolism. Churches were not just converted to mosques, but defiled first, with icons smashed and altars desecrated in ways designed to humiliate the conquered population. Mehmed's enforcement of the devshirme system, the periodic collection of Christian boys for conversion and training as janissaries, was perhaps more psychologically cruel than any single execution. Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages in the Balkans, selecting the strongest and most intelligent boys aged 8 to 18 for forced recruitment. Parents were forced to hand over their sons, knowing they would never see them again, that these boys would be brainwashed, converted, and eventually deployed to conquer and oppress their own people. The system was designed to break generational resistance by turning the conquered population's own children into instruments of their oppression. Economic warfare against conquered populations was systematic and designed to make Christian life untenable. The jizya tax on non-Muslims was set at punitive levels that impoverished families. Arbitrary confiscations of property enriched Ottoman officials while pauperizing Christian communities. Legal restrictions prevented Christians from testifying against Muslims in court, making them vulnerable to any accusation without recourse. These policies created economic pressure to convert while maintaining a pretense of religious tolerance. Those who remained Christian did so at the cost of generational poverty and vulnerability. The sexual violence sanctioned or encouraged by Mehmed's regime served as both reward for soldiers and weapon against conquered populations. The systematic rape of women and girls in captured cities was so common it was barely remarked upon in contemporary sources. More disturbing was the institutionalized capture of young boys for Ottoman harems and the Sultan's personal use. Mehmed himself was known to demand attractive young men and boys from conquered territories, a practice that combined sexual exploitation with psychological domination of defeated peoples. Refusing such demands meant death, not just for the individual, but often for their entire family. The final campaigns, The last years of Mehmed's reign saw no softening of his brutal methods, but rather their refinement and expansion as he turned his attention toward new conquests. In 1480, he launched an invasion of Rhodes, the stronghold of the Knights Hospitaller, a military order that had become a thorn in Ottoman maritime dominance. The siege revealed Mehmed's willingness to expend enormous resources and lives to eliminate even relatively minor irritants. The bombardment of Rhodes was among the most intensive of his career, with dozens of massive cannons firing continuously for weeks. The island's defenses, however, proved more resilient than Mehmed had anticipated. The failure at Rhodes marked one of the few times Mehmed was forced to abandon a siege without achieving his objective. The Knights Hospitaller, led by Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson, conducted a brilliant defense that inflicted heavy casualties on the Ottoman forces. When it became clear that the fortress would not fall before winter made campaigning impossible, Mehmed withdrew, but not before ordering brutal reprisals against Greek civilians on nearby islands whom he accused of supporting the Knights. Entire villages were depopulated, their inhabitants enslaved or massacred as punishment for Mehmed's own failure. The invasion of southern Italy, specifically the capture of Otranto in 1480, represented Mehmed's most audacious strike into Western Europe and revealed his ultimate ambitions. Contemporary sources suggest the Sultan intended Otranto as a beachhead for a larger invasion of Italy, possibly even targeting Rome itself. The symbolism would have been profound. The Muslim conqueror of Constantinople completing his victory by conquering the original capital of the Roman Empire. The sack of Otranto demonstrated Mehmed's methods would extend to the Italian peninsula unchanged. Mass enslavement, forced conversions, and execution of those who refused. The martyrdom of Otranto's clergy became a rallying point for Christian resistance and revealed the depth of religious conflict inherent in Mehmed's conquests. Archbishop Stefano Pendinelli and his priests were given the now familiar ultimatum: convert to Islam or die. Their refusal led to mass execution by beheading, with contemporary sources claiming over 800 men were killed for refusing conversion. The rock where the executions took place allegedly ran red with blood, and the bodies were left unburied as demonstrations of Ottoman power. The killings had the opposite of their intended effect, galvanizing Christian resistance rather than breaking it. Mehmed's plans for further conquest were cut short by his death in 1481, at the age of 49. The cause of death remains disputed among historians. Some sources suggest natural illness, possibly gout or stroke, while others hint at poisoning by his son Bayezid, who stood to inherit the throne. Given Mehmed's own history of fratricidal succession and the Ottoman tradition of sons eliminating rivals, the possibility of assassination cannot be dismissed. What is certain is that his death came suddenly while he was preparing a campaign into Syria, cutting short whatever additional conquests he had planned. The immediate aftermath of Mehmed's death revealed how much his empire depended on his personal authority and fear. The succession was contested, though not as bloodily as might have been expected. Bayezid II, who inherited the throne, proved a much less aggressive ruler than his father, preferring consolidation to expansion. The Ottoman forces occupying Otranto withdrew without the Sultan's driving will to maintain them. Vassal states that had submitted in terror began testing their boundaries, though most quickly learned that even without Mehmed, the Ottoman Empire remained the dominant power in the region. Mehmed's legacy was immediately contested. To his Muslim subjects, particularly in the Ottoman heartland, he was the conqueror, the greatest sultan who had achieved what no previous Muslim ruler had managed: the elimination of the Byzantine Empire and the transformation of Constantinople into the capital of an Islamic empire. His victories were celebrated in poetry and chronicle, his brutalities either downplayed or justified as necessary for the expansion of the faith. Mosques and institutions bearing his name proliferated across the empire, ensuring his memory would be honored. To Christian Europe, Mehmed was something far darker, the embodiment of existential threat, the Islamic conqueror who had shattered Christendom's defenses and brought Muslim armies to the gates of Western Europe. The terror he inspired lingered for generations, shaping European attitudes toward the Ottoman Empire and Islam more broadly. Nicholas of Cusa, Pius II, and other Christian intellectuals of the era spent considerable effort trying to understand and combat the Ottoman threat Mehmed personified. His name became synonymous with barbarism and religious tyranny, a boogeyman invoked whenever Europeans needed to rally against Muslim power. The systematic enslavement, one of Mehmed's most devastating but often overlooked policies, was the systematic enslavement of conquered populations on a scale that reshaped the demographics of the Eastern Mediterranean. The numbers are staggering. Contemporary estimates suggest that over 400,000 people were enslaved during Mehmed's 30-year reign, though exact figures are impossible to verify. This was not merely a side effect of conquest, but deliberate policy, with sophisticated systems developed to capture, process, and distribute human chattel across the Ottoman Empire and beyond. The slave markets of Constantinople, Bursa, and other Ottoman cities flourished under Mehmed's reign. These markets were carefully organized, with different sections for different types of slaves: young women for domestic service or harems, young men for agricultural labor or military service, children for various purposes including sexual exploitation, and skilled craftsmen who brought higher prices. The markets operated openly, with Ottoman officials taking taxes on each transaction. The normalization of this human trade, its integration into the economic and social structure of the empire, made it self-sustaining and almost impossible to eradicate even centuries later. The fate of enslaved women and girls was particularly harrowing. Beyond the obvious sexual exploitation, which was endemic and openly acknowledged, enslaved women faced systematic dehumanization. Separated from families and communities, often unable to speak the language of their captors, they became completely dependent on their owners for survival. The prettier or more skilled might find positions in wealthy households where treatment was relatively better, but the majority faced lives of brutal labor and abuse with no recourse to justice. Many did not survive their first year of captivity, succumbing to disease, maltreatment, or suicide. Young boys enslaved in Mehmed's conquests faced their own particular nightmare through the Dev-Shirme system. The most intelligent and physically capable were selected for elite training as janissaries, theoretically an honor, but in reality, a form of psychological destruction. These boys were forcibly converted to Islam, given new names and identities, and subjected to brutal military training designed to break their will and reconstruct them as perfect soldiers. The result was an army of enslaved soldiers whose loyalty was theoretically unquestionable because they had been separated from any alternative identity or community that might compete with the Sultan's authority. The long-term demographic impact of Mehmed's slaving operations was profound. Entire regions of the Balkans were depopulated, with estimates suggesting some areas lost 20 to 40% of their population to a combination of massacre and enslavement. This created labor shortages and economic disruption that took generations to recover from. The psychological trauma extended across generations as well, with communities living in constant fear of the next raid, the next conquest, the next round of enslavement. This fear shaped everything from settlement patterns to marriage customs to economic decisions. The complicity of local populations in the slave trade created additional layers of trauma and social breakdown. Mehmed's system often relied on local collaborators who would identify the healthiest and most valuable potential slaves in exchange for protection or payment. This turned neighbor against neighbor, created incentives for betrayal, and destroyed social trust in conquered territories. Communities that might have united in resistance were instead fractured by the poisonous dynamics of collaboration and survival. Escape from slavery was theoretically possible, but practically almost impossible. Enslaved people who tried to flee faced brutal punishments if recaptured, mutilation, torture, and execution being common. Ottoman law and international agreements offered no protection to escaped slaves, meaning there was nowhere to run even if escape succeeded. Some did manage to flee to Christian territories and freedom, but these success stories were rare enough to be noteworthy. For the vast majority, enslavement was a life sentence that ended only with death. The economic incentives created by the slave trade encouraged continuous conquest and raiding. Mehmed's soldiers were motivated not just by religious fervor or loyalty to the Sultan, but by the prospect of capturing valuable slaves who could be sold for profit. This created a self-perpetuating cycle. Conquests generated slaves, profits from slaves funded further military campaigns, and those campaigns generated more slaves. The system was diabolically efficient and would continue in various forms for centuries after Mehmed's death. Conclusion: the legacy of terror. Mehmed II died in his camp near Maltepe on May 3, 1481, at the age of 49. His body was brought back to Constantinople and buried in a mausoleum within the grounds of Fatih Mosque, the grand mosque he had built on the ruins of the Byzantine Church of the Holy Apostles. Even in death, his presence dominated the city he had conquered. His tomb a monument to his victories and a reminder of the price paid for Ottoman supremacy. The mausoleum's decoration included calligraphy celebrating his conquests and his title, Mehmed the Conqueror, the Sultan of the world. The question of how to judge Mehmed II remains contentious even today. By the standards of his own time, he was arguably no more brutal than many other conquerors. Medieval warfare was universally harsh, and the laws of war offered little protection to the conquered. Vlad the Impaler, Richard the Lionheart, Genghis Khan, and countless other historical figures committed atrocities comparable to Mehmed's. What distinguished Mehmed was perhaps not the nature of his cruelties, but their scale, efficiency, and calculated application as tools of state policy rather than expressions of rage or religious fervor. From an Ottoman perspective, Mehmed was the greatest sultan, the ruler who transformed a regional power into an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. His conquest of Constantinople was celebrated as the fulfillment of Islamic prophecy, the long-awaited victory that generations of Muslim rulers had attempted and failed to achieve. His administrative innovations, his patronage of arts and learning, his construction projects, these aspects of his reign are celebrated in Turkish historiography as evidence of enlightened rule. The brutalities are either downplayed as necessary wartime measures or justified as Allah's judgment on the infidels. Western historiography has generally been less sympathetic, portraying Mehmed as the destroyer of Christian civilization, the barbarian who extinguished the last light of Rome and brought darkness to the East. Victorian-era historians in particular portrayed him as the embodiment of Islamic cruelty and fanaticism, fitting perfectly into colonial-era narratives about the fundamental incompatibility between civilized Christian Europe and barbaric Muslim Orient. This perspective has been challenged by modern scholars who note the complexity of his reign and the comparable cruelties committed by Christian rulers of his era. Modern historians attempting objectivity face the challenge of evaluating Mehmed's actions by what standards? By contemporary medieval standards, he was a successful military commander who employed the tactics common to his era. By modern human rights standards, he was a genocidal tyrant who committed war crimes on a massive scale. Both perspectives contain truth, and the tension between them reveals more about our own assumptions about history and morality than about Mehmed himself. What cannot be disputed is the magnitude of suffering his conquests caused. Hundreds of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands more enslaved, entire cultures and communities destroyed or fundamentally altered. The psychological impact of Mehmed's reign extended far beyond his lifetime. For centuries after his death, the phrase, "the Turk is coming," could terrify children and adults alike in Christian Europe. The Ottoman Empire became Europe's existential threat, the enemy that justified crusades, military alliances, and the consolidation of Christian kingdoms into larger entities capable of resistance. Whether this fear was proportionate to the actual threat or inflated by propaganda is debatable, but its real effects on European development cannot be questioned. The trauma of Constantinople's fall and the subsequent Ottoman advances shaped European identity and politics for generations. For the populations that fell under Ottoman rule during Mehmed's reign, the legacy was complex. Some communities adapted, even prospered, within the Ottoman system. The Ottoman Empire offered certain advantages. Religious tolerance for Jews, for example, who fled persecution in Spain to find relative safety in Ottoman lands. The administrative efficiency of Ottoman governance sometimes compared favorably to the feudal chaos of Christianity.